The chair scraped back from the kitchen table with a sound like a wound tearing open, and Reuben Ford stood there in the gray morning light of his ranch house, holding a single folded piece of paper that trembled in his rough, calloused hand. His eyes moved across the words written in Susan's careful, looping script, and something inside him that had been holding together for 34 years of a hard and unyielding life simply came apart at the seams. He read the note a second time, then a third, his jaw set so tight that the muscles along the side of his face shook, and still the words did not change. Still they said what they said. He set the paper down on the table with the deliberate, careful movements of a man who understood that if he did not control his hands right now, he would put his fist straight through the pine wall beside the window. He walked to the front door of the ranch house and threw it open. The October morning spread out before him, vast and indifferent, the Colorado high plains rolling away into a purple horizon, still bruised with the last colors of night. Her mare was gone from the paddock. The gate to the small corral where she kept her things was hanging open on one hinge, swinging in the dry wind with a soft, rhythmic creak that sounded obscene in the silence. Her saddlebags were gone from the hook beside the barn door. Everything that was hers and hers alone had been taken in the night, quietly and completely, as if she had planned it down to the last hairpin. Reuben Ford had not cried since the day they buried his brother Thomas in the frozen ground outside of Pueblo, 12 years ago. He had not cried at his own father's funeral, had not cried through 3 seasons of drought that nearly stripped him of everything he had ever built, had not cried when a rattlesnake took his best cattle dog or when a late spring blizzard killed 17 head of his finest steers. He did not cry easily. He did not cry often. He did not, as a rule, cry at all. He stood in the doorway of the house he had built with his own hands on land he had bled to claim, and he let out a single, ragged breath that turned to mist in the cold morning air, and his eyes filled and burned and spilled over, and Reuben Ford wept in a way that had no sound to it, which was somehow the most devastating kind, because he had finally let someone in. And now she was gone. He had to go back. He had to understand how it had come to this. He had to understand how a woman he had been certain he did not need had become the one thing he absolutely could not survive losing. The story of Susan Bishop and Reuben Ford began, as most important stories do, in the middle of something else entirely. It was the spring of 1882, late April, when the prairie grass was just beginning to push through the remnants of a punishing winter, and the town of Hartwell, Colorado was doing what small frontier towns always did when a new person arrived. It was watching. Susan Bishop stepped down from the eastbound stage at 1:15 with a single trunk, a carpet bag, a pair of practical boots that had seen better days, and the kind of composed, clear-eyed expression that came not from confidence, but from years of practice at appearing unafraid when she was terrified. She was 26 years old. She had dark hair that she kept pinned severely away from her face, because there was no one left in her life to tell her she ought to wear it differently, and she had gray eyes that were the color of a sky before a storm that cannot yet decide which direction it intends to blow. She was not what anyone would have called beautiful in the conventional sense of the word. She was the kind of woman whose face grew more interesting the longer you looked at it, which was a far more dangerous thing than beauty. She had come to Hartwell, Colorado in response to an advertisement placed in the Denver Weekly Gazette by one Reuben Ford rancher, who required a woman of practical disposition and sound character to serve as housekeeper, and should mutual compatibility be established, as a potential wife. The advertisement had been worded with the same blunt efficiency that Reuben brought to everything in his life, listing the qualities he was looking for as though he were describing a good working horse. Good health. Willingness to work, no complaints about solitude, some knowledge of cooking. The advertisement had said nothing about romance, nothing about companionship, nothing about love, because Reuben Ford had not been thinking about any of those things when he wrote it. He had been thinking about the fact that his ranch house was a disaster, and that he had not eaten a proper meal in 6 weeks, and that the ledgers on his desk were 3 months behind, and that he did not have the time or the inclination to address any of these problems himself. Susan had read that advertisement 3 times. She had answered it for reasons that had nothing to do with romance either, which was, in retrospect, exactly why the whole thing had gone the way it did. She had been living in Denver for 2 years, working as a seamstress in a shop owned by a woman named Mrs. Clara Holt, who was not unkind but who paid poorly, and who could not guarantee that the shop would survive another year given the shifting economic currents of the city. Before Denver, Susan had been in St. Louis. Before St. Louis, she had been in Philadelphia, where she had been born and raised, and where she had made the catastrophic mistake of trusting a man named Arthur Day, who had promised her marriage and delivered instead a broken engagement, a ruined reputation, and a secret that she had been carrying like a stone in her chest ever since. The secret was not scandalous in the way that people meant when they whispered about a woman's secrets. It was something far more complicated than that, and she was not ready to tell it to anyone, and certainly not to a gruff rancher in Colorado whom she had never met. The wagon that picked her up from the stage stop was driven by a young man named Pete Alcott, who worked as a hand on the Ford ranch, and who had the cheerful, uncomplicated manner of someone who had never been forced to think too hard about anything. He loaded her trunk without being asked, tipped his hat, and chattered the entire 6-mile drive out to the ranch about the weather and the cattle prices and the quality of the spring grass without once asking her a single personal question, which she appreciated enormously. The ranch itself appeared on the horizon like a statement. It was not fancy. It was not pretending to be anything other than what it was, which was a serious and functional operation built by someone who cared more about durability than aesthetics. The main house was long and low, constructed of good timber that had weathered to a gray-brown that matched the surrounding land. A bunkhouse sat 50 yards to the east. The barn was large and solid. The fences were straight. The cattle visible in the far pasture were fat and healthy. Susan took all of this in during the last quarter-mile of approach and understood that whatever else Reuben Ford was, he was not a man who did things halfway. He was standing at the fence near the barn when the wagon came in, and he did not come toward her immediately. He finished what he was doing first, which was examining the front left hoof of a sorrel gelding with the focused attention of a man who considered interrupting his work a form of weakness. Then he straightened, wiped his hands on his denim trousers, and walked toward the wagon with the unhurried stride of someone who had decided long ago that running showed a lack of dignity. Susan climbed down from the wagon before Pete could offer his hand, because she had learned that the first impression she made on a new employer was the most important one, and she needed Reuben Ford to see immediately that she was not fragile. He stopped in front of her and looked at her with dark eyes that were the most direct she had ever seen, the kind of eyes that did not bother with pleasantries. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same rock as the mountains behind him. He had a dark beard that was neatly trimmed, which surprised her, and hands that were enormous and scarred in the specific ways that a lifetime of ranch work produces. He was 36 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who spend their lives outdoors and under pressure tend to look older, worn smooth by weather and hard use into something that was more interesting than it was handsome. "Susan Bishop," she said, because it seemed like the thing to do. "Reuben Ford," he said back. His voice was low and unhurried and carried the particular quality of a voice that was not used to making small talk. "You are smaller than I expected." She met his gaze without flinching. "And you are blunter than your advertisement implied." Something moved behind his eyes. It was not quite amusement, but it was in the same neighborhood. He said nothing. He turned and walked toward the house, and after a beat she followed him because that was clearly what was expected. He showed her the house, with the same efficient practicality that characterized his advertisement. The kitchen, which was large and cluttered, and held the lingering ghost of food cooked badly by a man who thought cooking was a problem rather than a craft. The parlor, which contained a desk buried under papers, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf that was the most surprising thing she had seen so far. The bedrooms, 2 of them, the one at the back being hers, and she noted with a kind of cautious relief that he did not make any assumptions about that arrangement. He showed her the root cellar, the smokehouse, the location of the well. He told her that his hands ate in the bunkhouse and were not her responsibility. He told her that he rose at 4:30 every morning and expected breakfast ready by 5. He told her that the ledgers on his desk needed to be organized, and that if she had any skill with numbers he would appreciate their attention. He told her that he did not require conversation, that he valued quiet, and that if she had complaints she should voice them directly rather than building up grievances. "Are you always this pleasant?" Susan asked. He paused at the door of the barn, where he was evidently about to disappear and return to his real life, the one that did not include having a stranger in his house. He looked at her over his shoulder. "I am always this honest," he said. "I find it saves considerable time." She watched him go. She stood in the yard of a ranch 6 miles from the nearest town in the state of Colorado, holding her carpet bag, surrounded by the enormous and indifferent sky of the high plains, and she thought, "Well, this will either be the making of me or the end of me," and she went inside and started putting the kitchen in order. The first 2 weeks were a negotiation conducted almost entirely without words. Susan learned the rhythms of the ranch the way you learn a new piece of music, by listening more than anything else. She learned that Reuben rose at 4:15, not 4:30 as he had said, and that he was already at the barn by the time most of the world was still deciding whether to wake up. She learned that he drank his coffee black and his meals simple, and that he had no patience for anything elaborate, but that when she made his mother's cornbread recipe, which she had found written on a folded piece of paper tucked inside a copy of the King James Bible on his bookshelf, he had stopped mid-bite and looked at her with an expression that was impossible to read. She learned that he could go an entire day without speaking, except to give necessary instructions to his hands. She learned that in the evenings he sat at his desk and worked by lamplight until 8 o'clock with the concentration of a man solving a problem that was always just barely within reach. She learned that he read, not the newspapers that Pete brought in from town, though he read those too, but real books, novels and histories and the occasional scientific text, and that his bookshelf revealed a person considerably more complex than his presentation suggested. She learned that his dark past was a country he lived in alone and did not invite visitors to explore. She also began, quietly and without meaning to understand the hidden pressures that surrounded the Ford ranch. She understood it through the careful way Reuben reviewed his bank statements, through the conversation she overheard between him and his foreman, a steady man named Marcus Webb, about a cattle buyer in Denver who had reneged on a contract and left them short for the season. She understood it through the visit of a man named Harold Creech, who arrived in a fine buggy one Tuesday afternoon and sat in the parlor with the proprietary ease of someone who considered himself a creditor rather than a guest. Harold Creech was the kind of man who had been given his advantages rather than earning them, and who had arranged the world around him to ensure that this distinction was never pointed out. He was the owner of the Hartwell Cattlemen's Bank, and he held a note on a portion of the Ford ranch's pasture land, and the gleam in his eyes when he looked at the ranch made Susan's stomach tight. She brought coffee because it was her job to bring coffee, and because she wanted an excuse to be in the room, and Creech looked at her with the particular gaze of a man who categorized women as objects of decoration or objects of convenience, and was trying to determine which category she fell into. Reuben noticed the look. The only visible sign of it was a very slight tightening of the already substantial tension in his jaw, but Susan, who had been observing him carefully for 2 weeks, did not miss it. After Creech left, Reuben sat at his desk for a long time without lighting the lamp even as the evening darkened around him, and Susan set a plate of supper near his elbow and said nothing. And that night, she understood for the first time that Reuben Ford was a man fighting on multiple fronts against forces that wanted very much to take away everything he had built. She began to help with the ledgers on the third Saturday, without asking permission. She simply sat down at the desk while Reuben was out with the cattle, opened the account books, and spent the better part of the day bringing order to 6 months of entries that had been made by a man who understood cattle pricing with mathematical precision, but who had no patience for the organizational requirements of bookkeeping. When Reuben came in at sunset and found her still at the desk, surrounded by neatly organized receipts and a ledger that was, for the first time in memory, balanced and current, he stood in the doorway for a long moment. "I did not ask you to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. "And I found 3 overcharges from your feed supplier and a payment from the Miller contract that was not recorded correctly. You are owed $14.60. Another long silence. "I see," he said finally. "You have good instincts about money," she said. "You simply need a better system for tracking it." He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. He said, "Thank you, Miss Bishop," in a voice that came out rougher than he clearly intended, as if the gratitude had surprised him on its way out. It was a small thing, but it was the first crack in the wall. May turned toward June and the plains warmed, and the days lengthened into the long, liquid evenings of early summer, and something between Susan and Reuben Ford shifted in ways that neither of them was in a position to name yet. They began to talk, in the practical way that people who share a space begin to talk, first about the ranch and the supplies and the accounts, and then about things that were somewhat adjacent to those practical concerns. And then, in the way that conversations have of expanding when you are not watching them carefully, about other things entirely. He told her, one evening when the supper dishes were done, and the lamp was burning low and neither of them had quite gotten up to go to their respective rooms, about his brother Thomas. How they had come west together from Ohio when Reuben was 22 and Thomas was 19, full of the particular recklessness that belongs to young men who have read too many newspaper accounts of Western opportunity. How they had worked their way through Kansas and into Colorado, doing whatever work presented itself, until Reuben had saved enough to put a down payment on the piece of land that would become the Ford Ranch. How Thomas had been the cheerful one, the one who made friends easily, who could walk into any saloon in any town and leave with 3 new people who considered him their best friend. How he had died in the winter of 1870 of pneumonia, 3 days after Christmas, in a tent on the edge of land they were just beginning to clear, and how Reuben had buried him himself because the ground was frozen and no one else was there. He told her this story in a flat, even voice with his eyes on the dark window, and when he was done, he said nothing else for a long time, and Susan did not fill the silence with the kind of empty comfort that she knew he would find insulting. She sat with the story the way you sit with something heavy that has been set down in front of you, acknowledging its weight. "He sounds like someone the world was better for having," she said eventually. Reuben turned from the window and looked at her, and something in his face shifted, some subtle rearrangement of the permanent guardedness that lived there. "He was," he said simply. She told him about Philadelphia, though not all of it. She told him about her father, who had been a school teacher, and who had raised her after her mother died when Susan was 8, who had given her the education that she was not supposed to have access to as a woman of modest means, who had drilled into her the conviction that understanding how the world worked was the only real protection anyone ever had. She told him about her father's death, 4 years ago, the stroke that had taken him between one sentence and the next while he was reading at his own desk, and how she had been alone since then in the particular way that losing the last person who knows you completely leaves you alone. She did not tell him about Arthur Day. She was not ready for that. She was not sure she would ever be ready for that. But she watched Reuben Ford listen to her with his full attention in a way that men rarely listened to women in her experience, not waiting for the place where he could speak again, not organizing his response while she was still talking, but actually listening, absorbing, and she felt something loosen slightly in the tightly wound center of her chest. It was June 15th when Harold Creech came back, and this time he did not come about the bank note. He came on a Sunday afternoon when most of the hands were in town, and he came with his hat in his hands, and a particular kind of carefully constructed charm that Susan recognized immediately as the costume of a man who wanted something, and had decided on flattery as his preferred instrument. He wanted Susan to join him for the Independence Day social in Hartwell. He presented this as a perfectly ordinary social invitation, while making it perfectly clear with every other element of his manner that it was nothing of the kind. Susan declined politely and went back to the kitchen. She could hear the low register of Reuben's voice from the parlor, not the words, just the tone, which had dropped into a register that was not quite a warning but was in the same family. She heard Creech's voice in response, lighter, more careful. A few minutes later she heard the sound of a buggy leaving the yard. Reuben appeared in the kitchen doorway. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and looked at her for a long moment. "You should know," he said, "that Harold Creech is not a man whose attention is flattering." "I know exactly what kind of man Harold Creech is," Susan said without turning from the dough she was working. "I declined." A pause. "Good," he said, and left. But something had changed in the air between them after that, something charged and complicated, and neither of them knew quite what to do with it. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that he immediately buried under his habitual blankness whenever he realized she had caught him. She began to notice things about him that had nothing to do with the practical requirements of sharing a house. The way he was patient to a degree that surprised her with the young ranch hands who made mistakes. The way he left small amounts of sugar out for the barn cats, even though he claimed to have no use for cats. The way his voice changed, became something close to gentle, when he was talking to his horses. She was not supposed to be falling in love with Reuben Ford. That was not what she had come here for. That was not what he had advertised for. She kept this awareness at the front of her mind as a kind of discipline, but it was like trying to hold back a tide with your hands. The 4th of July social in Hartwell was the first time they went somewhere together as something that looked, to outside observers, like a couple. This was not by design. Reuben had business in town and had told her she was welcome to come along if she wished, and she had wished to because she had not been to town in 3 weeks and was beginning to feel the particular stir-craziness that frontier isolation produces. The social was simply happening as it happened every year, and they were both there, and people drew the conclusions that people draw. Susan had not expected to enjoy herself. She was not a woman who typically enjoyed large social gatherings, having learned in Philadelphia that the social circuit was more often a hunting ground than a pleasure. But Hartwell's Independence Day social was a different animal entirely. It was held in the open field behind the general store, with a fiddle band that played with more enthusiasm than precision and long tables groaning with the collective cooking of the entire surrounding territory and children running in every direction. And the whole thing had an unpretentious, joyful quality that she had forgotten was possible. She talked to the women around her, wives and daughters of other ranchers and the town's business owners, and found among them a particularly sharp woman named Clara Dunning, who ran the town's millinery shop, and who had opinions about everything from cattle prices to the territorial legislature to the novels of Charles Dickens, and who made Susan laugh 3 times in the first 15 minutes of conversation, which was something she had not done in longer than she wanted to admit. She looked across the social ground and found Reuben watching her from where he stood with Marcus Webb and 2 other ranchers, holding a cup of lemonade he was obviously not drinking, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen there before. It was open, in some slight way, in the way a window is open just a crack, as if the general happiness of the occasion had found a hairline fracture in his defenses and worked itself through it. He danced with her. This was also not by design, or at least not by any plan that either of them would have admitted to. The fiddle band launched into a reel that pulled people from all directions onto the cleared ground that served as a dance floor, and somehow in the cheerful chaos of it, she found herself standing near him and his hand was at her waist, and they were moving through the steps of a dance that she only half remembered, and he clearly had not thought about in years. And it did not matter, because the music was carrying them, and there was something about his hand at her waist, warm and certain. That made the rest of the world go slightly out of focus. They did not look at each other during the dance. That would have been too much. But when the music stopped and they stepped apart, his hand lingered at her waist for exactly 1 beat longer than necessary, and she felt that 1 beat in every part of her body. The drive home in the wagon was quiet in the old way, the comfortable quiet that had developed between them over weeks, except that it was no longer quite comfortable. It was charged now with everything that had not been said, and she was very aware of the fact that they were sitting close together on the wagon seat, because it was a single seat, and there was nowhere else to sit, and that the night was warm and smelled of late-blooming prairie flowers and distant rain. "You were smiling tonight," he said when they were about 2 miles from the ranch, "more than I have seen before." "I was happy," she said, which was true and simple and cost her something to admit. Another long silence. The horses moved steadily through the dark. "Good," he said, in the same voice he had used when she told him she had declined Harold Creech. And then, after a moment, very quietly, "I was too." She looked at him then, and he did not look away. They arrived back at the ranch without having kissed, without having declared anything, without having made any move that could not be walked back from. But something had been established between them in that wagon, in that quiet admission, that could not be unestablished. Something had been acknowledged that had been growing all along without either of them giving it permission. July brought with it the revelation about Creech's hidden motives that Reuben had evidently suspected for some time, but had not been in a position to prove. Marcus Webb came to the house early on a Wednesday morning with a face full of trouble and a piece of paper in his hand that he had gotten from the county land office, where his cousin worked as a clerk. The paper was a copy of a filing that Harold Creech had made, quietly and without announcement. That was the first step in a legal process designed to challenge the boundary survey of the Ford Ranch's eastern pasture, exactly the parcel of land that represented the ranch's best water access. Reuben read the filing twice at the kitchen table while Susan read it over his shoulder, because she had not been asked to leave, and she was not about to volunteer to do so. The trap was elegant in its way. Creech had found an old, poorly drawn survey from 1864 that placed the eastern boundary of the Ford Ranch 50 yards further west than the current survey showed it, which would, if Creech's challenge succeeded, give him legal claim to the strip of land that contained the primary spring feeding the ranch's water supply. Without that water, the ranch could not function. That was the entire calculation. "He has been planning this," Susan said. Reuben set the paper down. His expression was the one she had come to recognize as his most dangerous, not angry, exactly, but absolutely still, the stillness of a man who was containing something very large and very powerful. "Since before he came about the bank note," he said. "The note was a pressure point. This is the actual mechanism. He wanted you struggling financially so you would be less able to mount a legal defense when he made his move," she said. Marcus looked at her with the slightly surprised expression that men in the West often wore when a woman demonstrated that she could reason through a problem. Susan had learned to be patient with this expression. Reuben did not wear it. He had stopped being surprised by her mind some time ago. "What do we need?" she asked. Reuben looked at her. "The original land patent from 1872, the survey commissioned by the Territorial Land Office when I filed the claim, and someone who can read legal documents well enough to draft a proper counterfiling. I can read legal documents, Susan said. He looked at her for a moment that stretched. I know you can, he said. She did not ask how he knew. She went to his desk and found the land patent in the third drawer, exactly where she had reorganized it 2 months ago, and she sat down and read it with the focused attention her father had taught her, and spent the next 3 days preparing a counterfiling that addressed every point of Creech's challenge with the clarity and precision of a woman who had nothing to lose by being thorough. On the 4th day, Reuben drove to the county seat and filed it himself, because that was what the law required, but he came back and found her in the kitchen and said, the clerk said it was the most comprehensive counterfiling he had seen from a private party in 12 years. And the way he said it, looking directly at her, was the closest he had come to saying something he had not yet said. That evening she was putting books back on the shelf, having dusted them, when she pulled out the Bible where she had found his mother's cornbread recipe, and a folded piece of paper fell from the back pages and opened on the floor. She picked it up. It was a letter, clearly old, written in a woman's handwriting, addressed to Reuben, and she would have put it away unread because his private letters were his business, except that the first line was visible before she could prevent herself from seeing it, and it said, I know you believe yourself incapable of letting anyone close to you, but you are wrong. You are wrong in the most fundamental and heartbreaking way. She folded it back up and set it on the shelf and never mentioned it. But she thought about it for days. She turned it over in her mind and wondered who had written it, and whether it was a letter sent or a letter that had never gone anywhere. And she thought about what it said, about the particular secret that Reuben Ford carried, which was not the dark past of a man who had done terrible things, but the dark past of a man who had been hurt enough that he had decided the only protection was to let no one pass the perimeter. She understood that kind of protection. She had built the same walls. She simply built hers differently. The letter from Philadelphia arrived on a Wednesday in August, and it cracked everything open. She had been in Hartwell picking up supplies from the general store when the postmaster, a round-faced man named Mr. Tillys, flagged her down and handed her a letter with a Philadelphia postmark and a handwriting on the envelope that she would have recognized from across a crowded room in the dark. Arthur Day's handwriting. She had not received a letter from him in over 2 years. She had not expected to receive one again. She did not open it in the street. She put it in her basket under a bolt of calico fabric and drove back to the ranch and did not open it until she was alone in her room with the door closed. Even then she held it for a long time without opening it, the way you hold something you know is going to hurt. The letter was 2 pages long and contained exactly what she had feared and somewhat more than she had anticipated. Arthur Day, it seemed, had undergone a conversion of conscience, or at least what he described as one, though Susan, who knew him well, suspected it had more to do with the fact that his current engagement to the daughter of a prominent Philadelphia family had come with a condition that he resolve all outstanding matters of character before the wedding. The outstanding matter in question was Susan herself, or more precisely, the secret she had been carrying. She had been pregnant when he ended the engagement. She had not told him. She had not told anyone. She had lost the baby 5 months into the pregnancy, alone in a boarding house in St. Louis, in a grief so complete and so private that she had never let herself fully feel it because there was no one to feel it with. The baby, a boy, had been born still, and she had paid for a quiet burial herself, and had spent the next 18 months moving steadily westward, putting geographic distance between herself and the life that had produced this loss, as if the miles could eventually outrun the weight of it. Arthur's letter was asking her to confirm, for the sake of his legal documents, that no child had resulted from their relationship. He needed it in writing. He was sorry for the distress. He wished her well. He remained, sincerely, her former acquaintance. Her former acquaintance. She set the letter on her bed and sat beside it and felt the whole of it move through her in a long, slow wave, the grief she had never properly grieved, the anger she had never properly been angry, the exhaustion of having carried this alone through so many states and so many rooms and so many sleepless nights. She did not go to supper that night. She told herself it was a headache. Reuben did not push her. He left a plate outside her door, which was a thing so quietly kind that she had to press her hands over her mouth to keep herself quiet. She made a decision. She was going to tell him, not because she owed him the information, because she did not. It was her private history, and she owed no one her private history. She was going to tell him because the alternative was to carry it alone indefinitely in a house where she was no longer alone, and because the letter from Arthur Day had reminded her in the most brutal way possible that secrets carried alone will eventually carry you somewhere you do not want to go. She told him the next evening, after supper in the parlor, with the lamp burning between them and the sound of the night outside, and her own heartbeat very loud in her ears. She told him everything. Arthur Day, the engagement, the broken promise, the pregnancy, the loss, the long westward journey towards something she had not yet been able to name when she left but had begun to suspect was something more than escape. She told it plainly and without decoration, the way her father had taught her to tell the truth, because dressing it up would be a disservice to the facts. Reuben Ford sat across from her through all of it without moving, without looking away, without doing any of the things she had feared men did when women told them things like this. He did not become uncomfortable, did not find a reason to look at his boots, did not produce the particular kind of careful sympathy that is actually just distance dressed up in polite clothing. He simply listened. He listened the way he always listened, completely, as if what she was saying was the most important thing currently happening in the world. When she was done, the silence lasted long enough for her to feel certain she had made a terrible mistake, and then he said, "What was his name?" "The boy." She blinked. Of everything she had expected him to say, that was not it. "I called him James," she said. "After my father." Reuben nodded. He looked at the lamp for a moment. Then he looked back at her and said, "I am sorry, Susan. That is a great deal to have carried alone." It was the first time he had used her first name. She broke then, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical quality of the kind of emotion she had always distrusted in herself and others. She simply broke. The way a thing breaks when the pressure holding it together is finally, carefully, released by a pair of hands gentle enough to be trusted with the task. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the small settee, which was too small for a man his size, and he put his arm around her with the cautious care of someone who was not accustomed to offering comfort but who was determined to do it right. And she leaned against his shoulder and wept for James, for the first time properly, with someone beside her. He sat with her through all of it and did not say anything else, and she understood that his being there was the sentence he did not know how to speak aloud yet. September came in with a dramatic shift in the weather, a cold front that rolled down from the mountains in the first week of the month and reminded everyone that the high plains did not believe in gradual transitions. The cattle needed to be moved to winter pasture ahead of schedule. The ranch was in constant motion, Reuben and Marcus and the hands working from before dawn until after dark, and Susan kept the household running like a mainspring and took over the books entirely so that Reuben could think about nothing except the cattle. Harold Creech's legal challenge had been responded to, but it had not gone away. A hearing before a territorial judge had been set for October, and the preparation for it lived in Susan's mind as a continuous background hum of strategy and concern. She had been corresponding, through Reuben's authorization, with a lawyer in Denver named Mr. Aldous Fletcher, who had experience with land patent cases and who had reviewed her counterfiling with considerable interest. "Fletcher says your filing is exceptionally thorough," she told Reuben one evening when he came in from the pasture, filthy and exhausted and smelling of cold air and cattle and honest work. "He says we have a strong case." "We," he said. He was washing his face at the basin, and he said it without looking at her, but she heard the particular quality the word had in his voice. It was not a challenge. It was something that sounded very much like recognition. "Oui," she confirmed. He straightened from the basin and dried his face and looked at her over the towel with those direct, dark eyes, and the lamplight was warm and the evening was quiet, and the moment held something between them that had been building since April and that neither of them was going to survive much longer without addressing directly. "Susan," he said. "Reuben," she said. A silence that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. And then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and she did not move away, and he cupped her face in his enormous, work-rough hands with a gentleness that was disproportionate to their size, and he kissed her. And it was not the kind of kiss that asks permission before knowing what it wants. It was the kind of kiss that has been decided on for a very long time and is finally, at great cost and with great relief, being executed. She kissed him back with equivalent conviction, and when they separated they both stood still for a moment, breathing slightly differently than before, and he rested his forehead against hers in a gesture she had not expected from him and which undid something in her that she had not known was still fastened. "I am not easy," he said. "I have spent a great deal of my life becoming harder to reach. I am not certain I know how to do this well." "I did not come this far looking for easy," she said. He pulled back enough to look at her. Something in his expression was different now, opened, the window thrown wide, the thing behind the wall acknowledged and standing in the light. "I do not want a housekeeper," he said. "I want to ask you properly. I want you to stay, not as a housekeeper, as my wife if you will have me." She looked at him. She looked at the man he had slowly and reluctantly and honestly become to her, the complexity of him, the difficulty of him, the buried tenderness and the fierce loyalty and the stubborn, unyielding decency that ran through everything he did. She thought about the barn cats and the cornbread recipe and his brother Thomas and the arm around her shoulder when she wept for James and the look on his face at the 4th of July social when he had not known she was watching him watch her. "Yes," she said, "I will." They were married on a Saturday in late September by the traveling Methodist minister, Reverend Elias Carr, who came through Hartwell once a month, and who performed the ceremony in the parlor of the Ford Ranch house with Marcus Webb and Pete Alcott and Clara Dunning as witnesses. And the room was small, and the words were plain, and Susan wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that brought out the storm color of her eyes. And Reuben wore his good shirt and his good boots, and had shaved that morning with a care that she found enormously endearing. He put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had been his mother's, which he had produced from wherever he kept things of great value, and his hands were steady, but she could feel the very slight vibration in them that was not uncertainty but intensity, the kind of steadiness that is maintained deliberately by someone who is feeling a very great deal. Reverend Carr pronounced them husband and wife, and Reuben kissed her in front of the assembled witnesses with considerably more restraint than he had kissed her in the kitchen 2 weeks ago, but with a warmth that was impossible to miss, and Clara Dunning pressed her handkerchief to her eyes and said, "Well, it is about time," to no one in particular, and Pete Alcott whooped so loudly that the horses shifted in the barn. October brought the legal hearing, and with it, the darkest week of what had otherwise been the best months of Reuben's life in recent memory. Harold Creech arrived at the hearing in Denver with a lawyer from back east, and an attitude of supreme confidence that Susan recognized as either genuine certainty or a very expensive performance of it. She and Reuben took the wagon to Denver and stayed at a boarding house near the courthouse, and spent the evenings reviewing documents with Mr. Fletcher, who was a small, precise man with spectacles and an impressive command of Colorado territorial land law. The hearing was conducted before Judge Horace Yates, who was exactly the kind of judge that the Western Territories produced: practical, impatient with theater, interested primarily in evidence and precedent. Susan sat in the gallery with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed, because she had learned that visibly worried women in legal proceedings were rarely helpful to their cause. And she watched Judge Yates listen to Mr. Fletcher's argument with the focused attention she had come to associate with men who did not need to perform being smart because they actually were. Creech's lawyer made his argument, which was polished and technically sophisticated, and relied on the 1864 survey with a confidence that suggested they believed it was unanswerable. Then Fletcher produced the original 1872 land patent, the subsequent survey commissioned by the Territorial Land Office, a deposition from the retired survey official who had conducted that survey in 1872 and who still lived in Pueblo and remembered it clearly. And finally, the piece of evidence that Susan had found herself during 3 days of meticulous research through the county records. A note in the original land office files indicating that the 1864 survey Creech was relying on had been flagged at the time of the 1872 patent as irregular and not authoritative, a note that Creech's legal team had either not found or had elected not to mention. Judge Yates looked at the note for a long time. He looked at Creech's lawyer with an expression that contained the judge's entire opinion of the proceedings in one flat glance. He ruled in favor of Reuben Ford on all points, dismissed Creech's challenge with prejudice, and awarded costs. Outside the courthouse on the Denver street, Reuben stood for a moment in the cold October sunlight, and Susan stood beside him, and neither of them spoke immediately. The relief was enormous. It was the kind of relief that takes a moment to actually reach you, that has to travel some distance from the rational understanding of what has happened to the place in the body where the fear has been living. He turned to her. His expression was the open one, the one she had learned to associate with the moments when he let himself be fully seen. He took her face in his hands, right there on the Denver street, in front of Mr. Fletcher and several passing strangers, and kissed her in a way that was not restrained at all, and she laughed against his mouth because she was so relieved and so happy and so entirely in love with this impossible, wonderful, difficult man. "You found the note," he said, when they separated. "In the records." "I was looking for it," she said. "I suspected they would not have been as thorough as they needed to be if they believed you could not match their research." He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of looking that she had come to understand meant he was feeling something too large for immediate words. "Susan Ford," he said, and it was the first time he had called her by her married name, and the way he said it was not casual. It was the way you say the name of something you intend to keep. November passed in the deepening of all things. The land was theirs, secure and certain. The cattle were settled in winter pasture and thriving. The accounts were in better order than they had been in years. The ranch house was warm against the early onset of winter, and there was a rhythm to their life together now that had settled from negotiation into something organic and mutual, two people who had found the particular frequency they fit at together. She learned things about him that no one else knew. She learned that he sometimes woke at 3 in the morning and went out to sit on the porch in the dark and cold because the dreams about Thomas still came, even now, 12 years later. She learned not to make him explain this, to simply make sure there was always a heavy blanket near the front door, and sometimes she came out and sat with him, and sometimes she didn't, depending on what she read from the quality of the quiet before she got there. She learned that his gruffness was not armor in the defensive sense, but simply the surface of a person who felt things very deeply, and who had decided long ago that deep feeling required protection from casual exposure. She learned that, when he thought she was not watching him, his face did things that his deliberate public expression never allowed, softened and warmed, and occasionally, when something pleased him, showed the ghost of a smile that was one of the finest things she had ever seen. He learned her too. He learned the particular silence that meant she was worried about something she did not yet want to talk about, and he learned to leave space around that silence without pressing it. He learned that she needed time to herself that was genuinely her own, not accounted for or explained, and he learned to create that space as naturally as he created space for everything else that was important on the ranch. He learned that she was funny, with a dry precision that caught him off guard at the exact moments when he needed to be caught off guard, and that she had an appetite for learning that matched his own, and that he had not expected to find in any person in the particular context of his life. He learned that she was brave, not in the showy way, not in the way that required an audience, but in the steady, private way that is actually the only kind of bravery worth anything. He was in love with her, he knew it. He had known it since sometime in June if he was honest with himself, which he had increasingly become. He had not said the words yet, not in that precise arrangement, because they were words that required the kind of vulnerability that still cost him more than most things, but he was working up to them, slowly and deliberately, the way he worked up to everything that mattered. He never got the chance to say them first. December arrived with a cold that settled into the bones of the land and stayed there. The weather turned dangerous in the second week, a series of storms rolling in from the northwest one after another, and the ranch went into its winter mode, conserving energy, managing resources, enduring. The letter that would destroy everything arrived on a Tuesday, with the mail delivery that Pete brought out from town on his weekly supply run. Susan was alone in the house when it came. Reuben was in the east pasture checking on the cattle. Pete set the mail on the kitchen table and left, and Susan sorted through it in the automatic way of someone who had been managing the household correspondence for months, and found between a seed catalog and a bill from the feed supplier a letter addressed to herself in the handwriting of a woman she had not heard from in 2 years. Her name was Margaret Boyle, and she had been Susan's closest friend in Denver, and the letter she had sent began with 4 words that made the room go cold. Something has happened here. Margaret's letter was long and hurried, and contained several pieces of information that Susan received in a sequence of deepening dread. The first was that a woman named Helena Voss had come looking for Susan in Denver, asking questions at Mrs. Holt's old shop. The second was that Helena Voss was the sister of Arthur Day's new fiancé, and that she had become convinced, based on Arthur's incomplete and self-serving account of his history with Susan, that Susan was a woman of compromised moral character who was seeking to interfere in the engagement. The third was that Helena Voss had apparently located the boarding house in St. Louis where Susan had stayed during the most difficult period of her life, and had spoken to people there, and had drawn conclusions from what she found that were accurate in their facts but profoundly wrong in their interpretation, and that she was apparently in the process of sending those conclusions to the woman's contacts in Colorado. Susan sat down at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her and felt the old, familiar chill of a trap closing around her. She was not ashamed. She was beyond shame. What she felt was the specific dread of someone who has built something new and beautiful on ground that she knew was near an old wound, and who can see the wound beginning to reopen. She thought about Hartwell. She thought about Clara Dunning and Pete Alcott and Marcus Webb and the other ranchers' wives who had begun to know her as Susan Ford, who had taken her in with the particular warmth of a community that needs its members. She thought about the way people in small frontier towns handled scandal, which was not gently, and she thought about Reuben. She thought about what it would cost him if a letter arrived here, as it might, as Helena Voss apparently intended, containing a version of her history that was weaponized rather than true. She thought about the land they had just defended. She thought about the respect he commanded and had worked for decades to build. She thought about Harold Creech, who had lost his case and who was certainly looking for another angle of attack, and about what ammunition a letter like that, arriving in the right hands, might provide. She made a decision in the space of about 20 minutes that she would later understand was the worst decision she had ever made, the decision born not from cowardice, but from a form of love so anxious it had turned into something that looked exactly like abandonment. She thought, if she was not here, there was nothing to attack. If she was not here, no letter could harm him. If she was not here, Whatever came would simply not find its target because the target would have removed herself. She did not think clearly enough, or far enough, or honestly enough about what removing herself would look like from where he was standing. She could not see it from where she was standing. She could only see the threat, and the decision that appeared to neutralize it, and the terrible logic of the thing that seemed, in her frightened and protective state, to make complete sense. She wrote him a note. She wrote it and rewrote it 4 times, trying to find words that would explain something that she was not sure language was adequate to explain, and what she ended up with was something that said she needed to go, that she was sorry, that she could not explain fully, that she hoped he would understand eventually, that some things were done for reasons that were right even when they looked wrong. She did not tell him about Helena Voss. She did not tell him about the letter. She did not give him enough to be able to find her, because she thought she was protecting him by being unfindable. She left after midnight when she was certain he was asleep. She took her mare and her saddlebags and the carpet bag she had arrived with in April. She did not take anything that was not hers. She rode toward Hartwell in the dark, in the bitter December cold, and from Hartwell she took the pre-dawn stage east toward Denver, because she had the address of the woman who had married Helena Voss's brother, and she intended to go directly to the source of the threat and end it herself, face to face, without Reuben's involvement. She thought she was being brave. She thought she was protecting something she loved by putting herself between it and the thing that wanted to destroy it. She was not wrong in her intentions. She was catastrophically wrong in her method. And Reuben Ford woke at 4:15 in the morning in the ranch house he had built with his own hands and walked to the kitchen to start the stove and found the note. He read it twice. He read it a 3rd time. He set it on the table with the deliberate, controlled movements of a man fighting himself, and he walked to the front door and opened it, and the paddock was empty where her mare should have been, and the gate to the small corral was swinging on one hinge in the dry December wind. He stood in the doorway, and he wept, without sound, for the first time in 12 years. He stood there for approximately 3 minutes. Then he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the specific gesture of a man refusing to let himself stay in pain longer than the pain requires, and he went back to the kitchen table and sat down and read the note a 4th time, and this time he read it differently. He was not reading it for what it felt like. He was reading it for what it said. She could not explain fully. She hoped he would understand eventually. Some things were done for reasons that were right even when they looked wrong. He sat with that for a long moment. He thought about Susan Bishop, whom he knew better than he had known anyone except perhaps his dead brother Thomas. He thought about her specific way of moving through the world, the direct courage of her, the logic she brought to every problem, the fact that she had never done a single impulsive or irrational thing in the 8 months he had known her. He thought about the particular fear she had named once, obliquely, that something from her past would find its way here and damage something that did not deserve to be damaged. He thought about the mail that had come the day before, which he had not gone through because he had been in the east pasture all day. He got up and went to the kitchen table where the mail still sat where Pete had left it, and he found the seed catalog and the feed supplier's bill, and he found beneath them, held together by its own weight, a letter and beneath it a second letter, this one addressed not to Susan but to himself. It had been sent from Denver, in a woman's handwriting he did not recognize, and it contained a version of Susan's past in Philadelphia rendered in the most vicious and most calculated terms possible, clearly designed to produce a specific response from a husband who had not known. He read it through once. He felt several things in rapid and contradictory succession: anger at Helena Voss, anger at Arthur Day, a grief for Susan that was almost physical in its weight, and underneath all of that, something clear and absolute and simple. He did not care. He did not care about any of the things this letter was designed to make him care about. He had known Susan's history from her own mouth, in her own words, and nothing in this malicious accounting changed any single thing he knew to be true about who she was. He looked at the note she had left. He understood now. She had seen the letter coming, or a version of it, and she had made a decision that was wrong in the most heartbreaking way possible. She had left to protect him from something that could not hurt him. He went and saddled his best horse, a powerful gray gelding named Cannon, and he rode for Hartwell in the pre-dawn dark at a pace that the cold December air made painful, and that he paid absolutely no attention to. He got to Hartwell as the town was beginning its mourning, and he went directly to the stage station, where the station master confirmed that a woman matching his description of Susan had taken the early stage to Denver. The stage had a 4-hour head start. He sent a telegraph to Denver from the Hartwell office, addressed to the Denver stage terminus, asking them to hold a woman named Susan Ford for her husband, who was following on urgent family business. Then he rode back to the ranch and changed horses, taking his fastest, a young bay mare named Petra who could sustain a pace that would close 4 hours of stage road advantage if he pushed her carefully, which he knew how to do. He told Marcus Webb where he was going with 4 words. Susan left. "I am going after her." Marcus said nothing except, "Be careful on the pass, it iced last night." Reuben rode. The stage road from Hartwell to Denver was 62 miles of increasingly difficult terrain, climbing through 2 passes before dropping into the Denver basin, and in December it was a road that demanded respect. Reuben paid the road what it required and nothing more, his attention divided between Petra's footing and the calculations of distance and time that were running continuously in the back of his mind. The cold was serious. His breath came in clouds. The landscape around him was the gray and white of a world that had committed entirely to winter, indifferent and vast and beautiful in the way of things that do not care whether you survive them. He caught the stage. He caught it at the base of the second pass, where the road descended into the foothills and widened, and the stage had slowed for the grade. He came alongside it on Petra, and the driver, a weathered man named Holt, recognized him and pulled the horses up. Reuben dismounted and opened the stage door, and Susan Bishop Ford was sitting inside in her good coat with her carpet bag on the seat beside her, and her face when she saw him went through 4 distinct expressions in the space of 2 seconds: shock, hope, grief, and something that was not quite guilt but was in the same territory. "You left," he said. His voice was level. He had had 62 miles on horseback to arrive at the emotion he could use. "I left to protect you," she said. Her voice was also level. She had had 4 hours on the stage to prepare for this possibility. "There is a woman in Denver who is attempting to send a version of my history to people here that will be used to damage you. I was going to find her and stop her myself." "I know," he said. She paused. "You know about Helena Voss? I found her letter in the mail pile this morning. After I found your note." Something moved across her face. "Reuben, it did not matter," he said. "None of what her letter said mattered. I want to make that absolutely clear to you, Susan. There is nothing in your history that changes what I know about who you are. Nothing." She wasted her postage. She looked at him. Her eyes were very bright, with the specific brightness of someone who is holding themselves together by deliberate effort and whose effort is currently being tested. You thought that leaving would protect me," he said. "And you were wrong, because the only thing that can actually damage me is being without you. Do you understand that? Do you understand that I found your note this morning and thought you were gone, and that was the worst thing that has happened to me in 12 years? Not the letter, not Creech's challenge, not the debt or the drought or any of the things I have faced. You missing, you gone, that is the only thing that can genuinely break me." She got out of the stage. The stage driver was looking very carefully at the road ahead. She stood in the cold morning air with her carpet bag and looked up at him, and she said, "You cried." It was not a question. She could see it in his face, or the remnant of it, the raw edges around his usual composure. "Yes," he said simply. He did not elaborate. He was a man who, once having admitted a thing, did not feel the need to dress it up. She stepped toward him, and he opened his arms, and she walked into them. And he held her with the specific quality of someone who has found something they thought they had lost, and has not yet fully convinced their body that it is real. He held her for a long time in the cold on the stage road in the Colorado foothills, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was steady and strong and present, and she understood what she had nearly done, what she had nearly taken from both of them with the best of terrible intentions. "I am sorry," she said against his coat. "I was trying to protect you." "I know," he said. His voice had the rough quality she had come to associate with the moments when he was feeling the most. "But Susan, you cannot protect me from needing you. You cannot go away and call it shelter." She looked up at him. The sky behind him was enormous and pale and going gold at the edges where the sun was climbing the mountains. "Then teach me how to let you carry it with me," she said. He looked at her for a moment with everything he was right there in his face, unguarded, unhidden, the man behind the gruffness and the walls and the 12 years of deliberately maintained self-sufficiency. "I love you," he said, and it came out quietly but with the weight of something that had been decided on in the most fundamental and permanent way. "I should have said it weeks ago. I intended to say it first. I apparently needed the right motivation." She laughed. It came out bright and slightly broken and entirely genuine. "I love you," she said back. "I have loved you since probably June, which is extremely inconvenient timing in retrospect." He kissed her right there on the stage road, and the stage driver whistled a tuneless melody and pretended to be absorbed in checking his harness, and Petra the bay mare snorted in the cold. They rode back to the ranch together. Susan rode on Cannon, the gray gelding, because Petra had run hard enough, and Reuben rode beside her, close enough that their knees occasionally touched in the narrow parts of the road, and they talked in the easy and exhaustive way of two people who have something enormous to process together. She told him about Margaret Boyle's letter, the full contents, without omission. He told her about reading her note and understanding what it meant. He told her, matter-of-factly, about the drive to Hartwell and the telegraph, and the 62 miles on horseback. "You rode 62 miles in December to come after me," she said. "I would have ridden 200, he said, without particular drama, as a simple statement of fact. She had to look at the road for a moment after that to keep herself from embarrassing herself, which she did not entirely succeed at. They dealt with Helena Voss, but not in the way Susan had originally intended. What they did instead was this. Susan wrote a letter from the Ford ranch, on a Tuesday afternoon with Reuben sitting across the desk from her doing his own correspondence, a letter addressed to Miss Helena Voss in Denver that was the most polite, precise, and devastating piece of correspondence that she had ever produced. It detailed exactly what had actually happened in Philadelphia and St. Louis, in language that was clear and factual and completely without apology, and it included a note from Mr. Aldous Fletcher, their Denver attorney, that outlined the precise legal consequences of continuing to disseminate false and damaging information about a private individual. It was signed by Susan Ford, with her married name prominent and underlined. The letter from Helena Voss that had presumably been sent to others in Hartwell did arrive, eventually, at the homes of 2 or 3 people in the community. The response was not what Helena Voss had calculated, because the community of Hartwell, having had 8 months to observe Susan Ford, had already drawn their own conclusions about her character, and those conclusions were not easily overwritten by the agenda of a stranger from Denver. Clara Dunning, who received one of the letters, walked directly to the Ford ranch the following Saturday, set the letter on the kitchen table in front of Susan, and said, "I have no idea who this woman is or what she imagines she is accomplishing, but I thought you should know it arrived, and that it has not changed a single opinion of you that I am aware of, and it will not." Susan looked at Clara Dunning and felt the particular warmth of being known, the specific privilege of having been seen long enough and honestly enough by another person that their knowledge of you is proof against the versions of you that enemies circulate. "Thank you, Clara," she said. "Now," said Clara, "are you going to offer me coffee, Or are we going to stand here in our feelings all afternoon?" Reuben, who had been in the doorway, turned away with the expression that meant he was concealing the ghost of a smile, and Susan heard, unmistakably, the low rumble of his laugh as he went back to the yard, and it was one of the best sounds she had ever heard. Christmas of 1882 was the first Christmas Reuben Ford had celebrated in the true sense of the word in many years. He had marked the day, the way he marked most things, practically and without sentiment, because after Thomas died, Christmas had become a day whose shape reminded him of everything it no longer contained, and so he had learned to make it small. Susan did not make it small. She did not do anything theatrical or excessive. She did not try to manufacture something artificial out of sentiment. But she cooked an enormous meal and invited Marcus Webb, who had no family in the territory, and Pete Alcott, whose family was far away in Missouri, and Clara Dunning, who was a widow and who lived alone above the millinery shop, and she trimmed the parlor with pine boughs from the trees along the creek, which smelled like winter and cold air and something ancient and good. She found, in the back of the box where Reuben kept things of value, a small wooden star that had clearly been a childhood ornament, worn smooth by handling, and she placed it on the mantel with the wordless understanding that this was not her permission to give, but that she was giving it anyway, on his behalf, the way you sometimes do things for people who have forgotten they are allowed to want them. He came into the parlor that evening and saw the star on the mantel and stood looking at it for a moment that stretched beyond comfort, and she watched him from across the room and did not say anything. He picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. He set it back down, and when he turned to face her, his eyes were bright in the firelight, and he crossed to her and put his arms around her from behind and held her back against his chest and said very quietly into the top of her hair, "Thank you. It belongs in the light," she said. "You put a great many things back in the light," he said. The evening was everything that the preceding months had been building toward, easy and warm, and full of the particular happiness that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from being exactly where you are supposed to be. Marcus Webb turned out to have a remarkably good singing voice, which no one had previously suspected, and Pete Alcott fell asleep in his chair after dinner with the innocent totality of the very young and very content, and Clara Dunning and Susan sat by the fire talking with the ease of women who are becoming real friends, and Reuben sat at the edge of it all with his coffee and watched his house full of people and felt something that he could only name as grateful. Late that night, after the guests had gone and Pete had been sent to the bunkhouse and the fire had burned low, they sat together in the parlor the way they had sat in the first months of her being there, except that everything was different and everything was the same, and she put her feet up on the settee and leaned against his shoulder, and he had his arm around her, and the lamplight was warm and the house held them. "I am glad you answered my advertisement," he said. "Your advertisement described you as a man of limited requirements," she said. "I recall no mention of love or happiness or Christmas." "I did not know yet that I required those things," he said. She tilted her head to look up at him. "And now?" He looked down at her with the expression that was fully open, the window thrown wide in every direction, every defense lowered without regret. "Now I cannot imagine what I was solving for without them," he said. She kissed him, and the fire settled in the grate, and the December night held the ranch close and quiet. The new year came in with the promise that the best years carry, the feeling of possibility rearranged by experience into something wiser and more durable than the optimism of youth. The Ford Ranch entered 1883 in the strongest position it had occupied in 5 years, financially sound and legally secured, its accounts in order, its cattle healthy, its water access certain. And Susan Ford, who had arrived in April with a carpet bag and a secret and a carefully maintained composure, discovered in February that she was pregnant. She told Reuben on a Sunday morning, in the kitchen, in the direct way she told him everything important. She simply said it while he was drinking his coffee, because she had decided that there was no ceremonially perfect moment for news like this, and that waiting for one would be a form of dishonesty. He put his coffee cup down very carefully. He looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression that she could not immediately read, which was unusual because she had become fluent in his expressions, and then she understood that she could not read it because she had not seen it before. It was newness, something in his face that had not previously been there, an opening of an entirely different dimension. He got up from the table and came around to her and took her hands in his and held them, standing in front of her, looking at her with those dark eyes that were doing something extraordinary at the moment, something that she thought was joy, pure and complete and slightly staggered by its own arrival. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said, which was so entirely like him that she had to close her eyes for a moment. "I am very well," she said. "The question is how you are." He looked at her hands in his for a moment. He said, "I am better than I have any right to expect to be." And then he pulled her into his arms and held her with that particular quality of care that she recognized as his most complete expression of everything he felt, the gentleness he had been keeping in reserve all his life for something worth deploying it on. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, and she was, as she had said, healthy. She continued managing the accounts through the spring and into the summer, slightly slower on some days than others, insisting on her usefulness and only occasionally permitting herself to rest in the afternoons, which Reuben advocated for with the careful persistency of a man who understood that demanding she stop working would be less effective than suggesting the rest was for his peace of mind rather than hers. On a bright morning in early November of 1883, their son was born in the ranch house with the assistance of the Hartwell midwife, a competent and calm woman named Mrs. Ada Reynolds, and with Reuben Ford present throughout in the way that most men of the era were not, because he was constitutionally incapable of being anywhere other than where Susan was when something important was happening. The baby was healthy and had his father's dark hair and Susan's storm-gray eyes, and he announced his arrival with a thoroughness that satisfied everyone in the room about the state of his lungs. "What do we name him?" Reuben asked, when the baby was cleaned and wrapped and lying against Susan's chest with the absolute contentment of someone who has just completed the most effortful journey of his very short life. Susan looked at her son. She thought of her father, the schoolteacher who had given her everything that mattered. She thought of Thomas, the brother Reuben had buried in frozen ground and grieved for 12 years. "James Thomas Ford," she said, "if you agree." Reuben was quiet for a moment. He was sitting on the edge of the bed close to her, and he reached out and touched his son's cheek with one careful finger, this enormous man whose hands were full of scars from a lifetime of hard work, touching this new and impossibly small face with the utmost delicacy. "James Thomas," he said quietly. "Yes, I agree." He looked up at Susan, and the expression on his face was the open one, the fully open one, every door wide. "Thank you," he said, which covered so much ground that she did not try to map it all. "You are welcome," she said simply, which covered the same ground. The following years were the good years, the years that make the difficult ones make sense in retrospect. The ranch expanded steadily, Reuben purchasing an adjoining parcel from a rancher who was retiring and returning east, so that the Ford land now ran from the creek to the base of the far ridge, a proper and substantial holding. Marcus Webb stayed on as foreman, and eventually built himself a small house on the eastern edge of the property, which suited everyone. Pete Alcott went back to Missouri, married a girl from his home county, and wrote every Christmas. Harold Creech, stripped of his legal weapon and deeply aware that he had been bested through means he had not anticipated, ultimately sold the Hartwell Cattlemen's Bank to a larger institution in 1885 and left the territory entirely. His departure was not mourned. Clara Dunning and Susan maintained the friendship that had begun over lemonade at the 4th of July social, and that had deepened into the kind of friendship between women That is one of the quiet foundations of a good life. They wrote to each other constantly, when circumstance kept them apart, and argued cheerfully about books and politics, and the appropriate amount of cayenne pepper in a meat stew when they were together. And Clara was present for the arrival of the second Ford child, a girl, born in the spring of 1886, whom they named Anna Margaret Ford, the Margaret for Susan's friend in Denver who had written the warning letter that had, in the most roundabout and painful possible way, brought Reuben and Susan to the stage road in December, and the honesty that lived on the other side of that encounter. Anna had her mother's dark hair and her father's determination, and very early demonstrated the combination of stubbornness and intelligence that was the Ford family signature, which delighted Susan and caused Reuben to say, on several notable occasions, that he now understood how his own father must have felt, which Susan considered the highest possible form of justice. The summer of 1887 was a particularly fine one, warm and well-rained and generous, with the kind of weather that makes the Colorado High Plains the place it is at its very best, with the mountains brilliant against a sky of impossible blue, and the grass high and sweet, and the cattle fat, and the ranch running like a properly maintained instrument. James Thomas Ford, approaching his 4th birthday, was at the stage of becoming a person that Reuben found simultaneously alarming and extraordinary, talking constantly, asking questions about everything, following his father around the ranch with an intensity of attention that Reuben received with the slightly stunned expression of a man who had not anticipated being idolized, and who found the experience both enormous and somewhat humbling. On an evening in July, with Anna asleep and James nearly so, and the supper dishes done, and the evening coming in soft and golden through the windows, Susan sat at the desk in the parlor, which she shared with Reuben now on a properly equitable basis, and she was writing a letter to Margaret Boyle in Denver, telling her about the summer and the children and the state of the accounts, and the condition of the eastern pasture where the grass was particularly fine this year. And she paused in her writing and looked up and found Reuben in the doorway, watching her with the expression she had named, privately, the open one. "What?" she asked. He shook his head slightly. "Nothing," he said. And then everything. He came into the room and sat in the chair across from the desk, and he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was arriving at something he intended to say. "Do you remember your advertisement?" she asked. She had asked him this before at intervals because she liked the answer. "I remember it," he said. "You were looking for a woman of practical disposition," she said. "You listed it like livestock criteria." "I was an idiot," he said calmly. "You were," she agreed, "a very lucky idiot. Because you answered," he said, not as a question. As a fact he had spent 5 years verifying from every possible angle and found consistently true. She set her pen down and looked at him properly. This man, her husband, who had cried without a sound in the doorway of his own house, because he thought she was gone, who had ridden 62 miles in the December cold of Colorado to find her on a stage road, who touched their children's faces with the same careful hands that could do the hardest work the land required, who had shown her over 5 years of daily and specific evidence that he meant every word of what he had said on that stage road. "The only thing that can genuinely break me is being without you. I am glad I answered," she said. He got up from his chair and came to her, and she stood to meet him, and he held her in the evening light with the assurance of a man who has stopped being surprised by his own luck and has decided instead to be continuously grateful for it. The ranch was quiet around them. The children were sleeping. The land they had defended and built and shaped together spread out in every direction under the summer sky, solid and real and entirely theirs. "Reuben," she said into his shoulder. "Susan," he said into her hair. Nothing more needed saying. Everything that required saying had been said, in one form or another, on every day of the past 5 years, in the small daily language of two people who had chosen each other and gone on choosing, through legal battles and secrets and grief, and the particular darkness of a December night when everything nearly came apart, and through the ordinary, extraordinary business of building a life on ground that held. James Thomas Ford woke from his almost sleep and called from his room, very clearly, and with the authority of someone who felt strongly about bedtime stories. "Papa." Reuben pulled back from Susan with the expression that had become one of her absolute favorites, the one where he was trying not to smile and failing. "Papa," she repeated softly, with all the warmth in her. He went to read to his son, in the low voice that carried through the thin walls of the ranch house like something fundamental, like the sound the land makes when the weather is right and everything is as it ought to be. Susan stood in the parlor doorway and listened, and the evening settled around her, and the ranch was still, and the stars were coming out one by one over the Colorado plains, and Susan Ford understood that this was exactly the life she had been moving toward all along, across all the cities and the miles and the secrets and the losses, toward this man and this house and this ground and this happiness that was not the easy kind, not the unearned kind, but the kind you build by hand from materials that include both the beautiful and the hard, which is the only kind that lasts. James fell asleep before the story ended, which was always how it went, and Reuben came back to the parlor and sat in his chair and picked up his book, and Susan went back to her letter, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the Colorado night was big and dark and full of stars, and inside the ranch house built by a man who had once believed himself incapable of letting anyone close, everything was warm and lit, and exactly as it should be. Anna Margaret Ford in her small room slept peacefully. James Thomas Ford in his breathed the slow breath of the deeply content. Reuben Ford read 3 pages of his book and then set it down and looked across the room at his wife, who was writing her letter with the focused attention she brought to everything, and he felt what he always felt in these moments, the specific gratitude of a man who understands precisely what he almost did not have. "Susan," he said. She looked up. "I am glad you stayed," he said, which was not what he had said on the stage road. What he had said on the stage road was that he was glad she had answered the advertisement. This was more specific. This was about the staying, the daily repeated choice of it, the fact that every morning she was still there, which was still, 5 years on, a fact he did not take for granted. She smiled at him, this woman who had come out of the East with a carpet bag and a secret, and gray eyes the color of a storm that cannot yet decide which way it will blow, who had organized his ledgers and found the legal note that saved his land and told him the truth about herself, and wept for her son James on his shoulder, and written the letter that ended Helena Voss's campaign, and ridden back to the ranch through the December cold beside him, and stood at the altar of the small parlor and said yes, and meant it and gone on meaning it through every season since. "I am glad I stayed too," she said. She was. She was simply, completely, permanently glad. She went back to her letter. He went back to his book. The lamp burned warm between them. The Colorado night held the ranch and everyone in it, and the Ford land ran from the creek to the base of the far ridge, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.